All right, welcome to Sunday School, and we are up to Genesis 39. So if you remember last time, Joseph ticked off all his brothers, got into a pit, sold into a caravan, and then we spent most of the time talking about the strange little story in Genesis 38 around levirate marriage and telling us something about Judah and his offspring. And as I said, we'll hold on to that story to see if in the end we feel like it wasn't just a misplaced side adventure or if it helps build the narrative around Joseph. So let's jump in. And again, we're going to be hearing today very familiar stories, I think, for most of us around Joseph. But again, be thinking about how this fits into the broader narrative that we've been talking about to see the way this story is building upon itself in ways now that we've been reading Genesis that we would actually expect. All right, can everyone see? We good? Now, Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. And let me pause. Again, for us modern Western Protestant Christians, it just sounds like banal truism to say, and the Lord was with him. We're like, well, of course the Lord's with him. But again, the same like when when Jacob was leaving the land, this idea in the ancient world that deities were territorial. They belonged to a place, they ruled over a place. And once you left their territory, you were under the auspices of someone else, right? That's the conventional wisdom. You leave your God at the border, and then you are under the power and influence of other deities. The same way, think politically for us. You leave the United States, you are now under the laws of Mexico, Canada, wherever you are, and their rulers have authority over you, okay? So to say he goes to Egypt, but the Lord was with him, and it caused all that he did to prosper in his hand, or we'll get to this next line where we're going to see this carry out, but the Lord was with Joseph is a big deal. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands, right? Well, that makes sense. He's part of this line, right? God blesses him. God is doing these things. So Potiphar sees this, all right? So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there, he had no concern for anything about the food, but the food that he ate. Now think about this. This is like I've seen movies, right? I love Bible movies. And in movies, it's because this is the smartest, most sophisticated guy. And in the TNT version, really good Bible movies, actually. But movies are fun because they're interpretive, right? A Bible movie is a kind of interpretation of how to read the story. And in the TNT version, Potiphar was illiterate, but he was this powerful man, and he was embarrassed about that fact. And then he noticed Joseph, his slave, could read, and he could look at the plans of something he was building, and Joseph could read it and interpret it. So it was like, oh, let me use this guy, right? So it shows Joseph growing in favor and stature because he was this educated, sophisticated young man who could bring, his expertise. It's nice and all, but that's not the theme in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis is God is going to favor this line of people. He decided, right? He's going to give them a great name, make of them a great nation. He will bless those who bless them and curse them that curse him. and that they will end up possessing all the land. So here's a perfect example. Even though Joseph gets sold into slavery, he's being blessed by the Lord. And the fact that Potiphar gives him authority of his house, that's going to cause Potiphar and his entire house to be blessed. This is the theme of the book, the promise of Genesis 12 being carried out. But like any good story, there's going to be conflict, which is going to cause the plot to turn. Now, Joseph was handsome and good looking. Now, again, the Bible tells us nothing in Hebrew literature that it's not going to build upon. So that's not just side detail. So you can imagine this guy in your head. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." This was the part in the TNT movie where I had to kind of fast forward with the kids because, you know, it's really good. And there's a hot tub scene, which is really kind of weird. But anyway. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look with me here. My master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you had brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." All right, a few things I want to point out here. First, this is good Hebrew narrative because it is extremely redundant. It tells us, right, what was happening, and then it tells us what happens, and then she tells the other people what happened, and we keep getting it over and over. And again, if Kathy's grading English paper, she's going to tell somebody, like, this is too repetitive, clean it up. Hebrew style, this is good stuff. They're continually, like, this is the narrative. It's like, there's this continual telling, it happens, and then it redescribes it. And we see this in the New Testament too. You see this a lot in Acts, right? With the story of Peter and the centurion, and then afterwards, when the church is kind of doubting, why were you off with the Romans? And he keeps retelling and telling of the retelling, and it has this kind of approach. So one, that's good Hebrew style. But two, notice a couple themes. And again, we don't see this when we just read Genesis in the context. But think about the nature of this sexual, I don't know how we describe it. Her impressing herself on Joseph and then his avoiding her. We have stories around sexuality that always tends to end up in a bad situation, beginning with Jacob and his daughter Dinah, right? With the story of Shechem, which turns into a massacre. You have the story of Reuben, who breaks boundaries, where he is going to lie with his father's concubine, which upsets him, which is going to come back up later. Then we have the Levirate marriage story, last chapter, and this idea of a father-in-law sleeping with his daughter-in-law, and all of these crossing appropriate sexual boundaries causes issue and a divide. It causes a break. in relationship. Here in this story, Joseph actually fights off this temptation, does the right thing, but we're still going to see it as heading in a, as in a break in relationship. But when we follow the story through, we're going to see that it all works for good. The other thing I want to point out, and again, this is just great literary, in Hebrew, a lot of Hebrew literature, they talk about these key words that are just gonna keep being played over and over. And we've seen this a couple times in Genesis. But notice like garment, garment, garment. The story begins with Joseph being set apart because of a special garment. And then when his brothers fake his killing, they do something to his garment. Mm-hmm. And when they want to tell their father what happened in their lie, they show him a garment. And now in this story, it's Joseph leaving behind his garment, which is going to be used against him. And so again, I don't want to build a huge like theological thing out of it, but as far as like storytelling goes, right, there is this play on the idea of Joseph's clothes are always get him into trouble one way or the other. Any comments or questions on this?
Were clothes or garments a theme in other non-biblical literature of the time?
No, not specifically. It's specific to this story. I mean, usually when things come up about garments that get emphasized in a text, it's often about someone disguising themselves. But this one here, it's always tied somehow to Joseph and his uniqueness, but which over and over as we see backfires. What was seen as a gift of Joseph in the beginning to, exalt him with his clothing just keeps going badly. As readers, we try to put ourselves in the mind of original hearers and readers. And on some level, and again, maybe this is just me, but I see there's some level of humor in this. Then again, sometimes people accuse me of the old, if you're a hammer, all the world's a nail. And I find humor in everything. So maybe they didn't intend it to be funny at all, but there's an irony in it at least that we can agree on. So when the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. So on one level, you see Joseph sinking. He's the favored son who ends up in a pit, who gets sold into slavery, and now in slavery, he goes to prison. All right, so it's like we're watching a descent. But at the same time, we have this language about blessing, right? Like it seems like they're going in opposite directions. 21, verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph, right? This keeps coming up. He's never out of the Lord's presence, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So now it's like, hey, the jail is being blessed because Joseph is in charge. So again, this theme of Genesis 12, no matter what you do with Joseph, no matter where you put him, it's going to go really well for Joseph, and it's going to go really well for whatever situation he's put in if he's treated right. And so again, Genesis 12 is reconfirmed even with Joseph in a jail in a foreign country where he's been sold into slavery. Let me add one other just small thing. Throughout this account, and again, this is one of those things that you're not going to read anywhere, but I think it's worth talking about. I think in the most ancient of times, the word Hebrew. Notice how she calls him a Hebrew. Been a lot of conversation about the word Hebrew. Most people, I shouldn't say most people, there's been a long ongoing conversation in scholarship about where the word Hebrew comes from. There was a word in the Semitic languages in that region of Hapiru or Abiru, which was a sociological term meaning like an outsider. In Hebrew, the word Hebrew stems from a meaning that's related to the word for like over or across, and because they come into the land across the Jordan River from outside of the land to the Canaanites, some have argued that the word Hebrew is like the over there people. The people came from outside. But this word Hapiru or Apiru outside the Bible tends to mean like the riffraff. It's not like an ethnic term. It's like the lower class people, where you will read in the Amarna letters, which are between the Akkadian peoples of Mesopotamia and the Egyptians. They found in Egypt this whole archive. They talk about these Hapiru, who are like these thorn in the flesh of the city states in Canaan. Like these Hapiru are around and they're causing trouble. And so scholars have tried to relate, are the Hapiru the same as the Hebrews? And it's hard to tell if those are supposed to be seen as the same people or not. But most of the time, when we have people using this word Hebrew in the Bible who are not Israelites, they use it in a way that tends to be a slur. So when she's saying, hey, you brought this Hebrew into my house, that's not a positive thing. It's not like just saying you brought an Israelite. It's like you brought the riffraff into my house and look what he did. And what's really interesting is the few times you have insiders, you have Israelite people, or the people we'd call the Hebrew people, referring to themselves as Hebrews in the Old Testament. Moses does it once, and it almost seems like he's downplaying who they are to the Pharaoh. Like, hey, we're just Hebrews, right? So it's almost like a self-deprecating kind of thing. So when Potiphar's wife keeps saying Hebrew, 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 read that with a little curled up nose, like, oh man, you brought one of those Hebrews into my house. Don't read Hebrew like you would read Israelite. All right. That was a little extra.
Dean, isn't it kind of interesting that everything Joseph does is blessed, just like the blessing that God gave Abraham, as far as I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you?
Exactly right. This is showing, doesn't matter where he is part of his line, and God made a promise he would do this no matter what, and he's continuing it on. So in the same way, when we saw the patriarchs who went into foreign places and they lied and deceived, God still blessed it. How much the more Joseph, who is upstanding, he's trying to do the right thing, God's going to continue to bless everything he touches. Any other thoughts or comments on this chapter? All right, let's see where it goes. He's in prison, making it the best jail anyone's ever seen in Egypt. All right, chapter 40. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each with his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, Why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Right? This guy's been given dreams since he was a kid. So he's like, hey, this is my wheelhouse. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine, there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. The Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. All right. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, right? He said, ooh, that's pretty good. Let me hear mine. I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. All right, let me pause here. I like the NRSV in this translation because they do a great job of the Hebrew of how these 2 dream interpretations go, because they seem like they're saying the exact same thing. And the first one says, he will lift your head up, meaning that's like Hebrew idiom, right? Like he will raise your stature. But then he says to the other guys, and he will lift your head up from off your body, right? So it's like, oh, just wait, that's not good. But it builds where it's like he's telling the guy who's asking, because he's like, oh, these are good dream interpretations. And he thinks it's going the same way. I'm going to be back in 3 days. And it's like, oh, he's taking my head off. And he will hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which I always wonder, like, how did that conversation end? But the text doesn't need to tell us that, so it just jumps on to the next thing. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. All right, so
Question.
does exactly what he said. He tells them the dreams come true. The one caveat is like, this is my ticket out of Dodge. But the chief baker, cup baker, was so excited about being back, he forgot about Joseph. John.
Do you know of any midrash that tries to explain what the heck the poor baker did?
That's a good question. I don't. I mean, I'll look into that this week. No, because yeah, it's and I don't. Technically, that would be the kind of thing they wouldn't care about because it was a foreigner anyway. But I'll check. I'll check just to see.
Okay. It's not really important. I was just curious.
No, but I am too now. That's a good.
Yeah, I was wondering too, because he got worse punishment than Joseph, and Joseph allegedly was with the wife. So
Right. But the wife of the servant of the king, not of the king. Everything goes worse when it's with the king.
And the king takes his bread very seriously.
That's exactly right. And again, if it's like a typical ancient Near Eastern scenario, you would think it's because the king thought he was being poisoned, right? Like the fear always, and the kind of reasons these kind of people end up in prison is if there's the thought like there was some kind of plot on the king's life or conspiracy. It's like you clear house, right? All these people were in on it. I mean, it's why you have, royal tasters, right? So it's like, put everybody down there. So this was the period after his FBI had investigated everybody and said, hey, the cupbearer was good. He had nothing to do with it. So yeah. Any other thoughts or comments on this chapter? This is our famous dream, right? We've heard this one since we were little kids, right? These dreams. But again, Joseph is the dream interpreter. And again, in the ancient world, that was a big deal because dreams were a normal, I don't know if normal is the right word, but dreams were an expected way that God spoke to people. God declared what was to be by telling people through dreams. But you needed to have the special, like, same way if someone sent you a note, you probably couldn't read it in those days. So you had to go to a scribe to interpret it for you. The same way, God might give people dreams, but who could interpret? And Joseph just so happens to have this gift. There were a lot of ways in the ancient world that it was perceived that God spoke to people, but very few of them were considered legitimate to ancient Israelites. So most of the stuff was called divining, and that was considered a blasphemous thing to do because God did not want you finding out his thoughts those ways. But dreams were okay. All right, let's move on. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Now, let me just pause here for a second, because I don't know if this is a valid interpretation or not, or if this is just the personality of my advisor in graduate school, who, when we went through this passage, he said he saw in this the potential of a bit of a satire on the people of Egypt and the wise and these insightful wise men of Egypt, because he's like, you couldn't come up with a more obvious dream. How is everybody puzzled by this? But I don't know if that's just from knowing and hearing the story so often, or if it would have struck ancient people the same way. Like, wait, how did all the people in Egypt not be able to figure out that little conundrum? But anyway, that was his perspective. Like, there was a little bit of tongue in cheek in this. Like, all the wise people in Egypt couldn't figure out this. The skinny cows eat up the fat cows. But anyway, I don't know if that's true or not, but it still always makes me chuckle when I read this passage. So then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Okay, so the timing is 2 years later, to which Joseph would be frustrated, thinking, I told you, tell the Pharaoh about me. But if you think about it logically, if the Pharaoh heard that at that point, he's like, whatever, great, there's a dream kid down in the prison. That's not that important or significant to him. But in the midst of the time when he's like freaking out over not being able to solve this puzzle of the 7 ears of corn and the 7 cows, it was perfect timing for him to hear that there was a dream interpreter. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Now that's an interesting cultural tidbit within the kind of Semitic tradition of the peoples that would have been in Canaan, the people that would have been in Mesopotamia, right? They are always pictured bearded, big beards, right? But in Egypt, everyone was always clean shaven. So it's some people say, hey, that's one of those details in the text that shows this isn't some guy just writing something with no background. This is someone who's telling a story who knows the world he lives in, because that is what would happen. But you wouldn't bring some, rough looking bearded Semitic guy into Pharaoh. You would bring in someone who looked like an Egyptian. So they shaved him clean. They changed his clothes, and he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I fell asleep a second time, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. But when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. Now, once again, if we were writing a story in English, we'd say, so then the Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams, and we'd move on, right? We wouldn't rehearse the whole thing again, but that is typical Hebrew style. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. After them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. All right, now notice, Joseph does 2 things here. He interprets the dream, and he understands that the 2 dreams are one. But Joseph is wise, and he is no fool, because with the dream interpretation, he does something that would be very unexpected. He turns himself into like a royal wiseman / counselor and gives the king a plan, right? That's not what a dream interpreter does. A dream interpreter interprets the dream, and then they step away. King, you do your thing with this, right? But that isn't what he does. He gives an interpretation and gives an appropriate strategic response. right? And here's the part that's really fascinating about this story. Pharaoh is going to listen, and in listening, the foreign land of Egypt is going to be blessed because he blesses Joseph. Like this blessing thing even goes to nations who treat these people of God well. So the proposal, verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. The 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Joseph said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. And since the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. All right, now think about this in the context, not just of a Joseph story, which is how we usually read this, but in the context of the book of Genesis. In the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we have a creation where all things are good and right. By chapter 3, the people listen to a serpent, they eat the fruit, God curses the man, woman, and the serpent. And we see from Genesis 3 through Genesis 11, everything breaking down. And in this breaking down that theologians call the fall, we see this picture that these bonds are all broken, right? Between humans and God, humans and humans, and humans and nature. And we see people trying to find ways to overcome this. So we have people building towers, right? Like, how do we build people together? The Nephilim try to make a name for themselves. These people try to do the things that always seem to fail. The people become so violent that God has to wipe them out with a flood. After the flood, we have that creepy story of Noah and his sons, where all of a sudden there's a divide between sons and there's blessing and cursings and who's going to be a slave of whom. Remember, Canaan, the grandson of Noah, would be a slave to his brothers. We come to the Tower of Babel. At every turn, there's dividing and separating out until God makes a promise in chapter 12 that it's like he grits his teeth. These people can't figure this out, but I will pick a man and I will bless his family and I will make them a great name, a great nation. I will give them the land and I will bless anyone who blesses them and I will curse anyone who curses them. And this will spread through this man and his family. The means of blessing. I mean, here's the thing. And again, I know this sounds very New Testament, but even in the Old Testament, you have this picture that God says, through this person, I will bless everyone who is willing to bless him, and I will curse everyone who curses him. So it's not even dependent upon people finding a way to be right and do things like build towers to the heavens and these great deeds. They just have to bless the person ordained by God in this family. And God's blessing would spread out that way to everyone, okay? And then you start with people like Abram, who's a wandering nomad, right? And he can't have children and he's struggling to be established in the land. And then he has trouble having an heir. And then within his family, we end up having Isaac. And again, struggling to have an heir, but nomads wandering in the land. And when things are bad, what do? They go into a foreign land, lie about their spouses because they're so worried, like what's going to happen to us? But God keeps blessing them. And then we get Jacob, who's a mess, right? But that doesn't matter. God blesses him because he promised to bless him. And when people do good things, like Laban employs him, Laban is blessed and things go well with him. When Laban turns on him, well, then things don't go quite as well. And it continues and it continues. And when he comes back to the land, they're still on the fringes. And this whole story about Jacob and the people of Shechem, and he's like, now you made me look bad and we're not that strong. And what are the people of the land going to do to us? Right? And this continues on. We get to the end of this. And Joseph, not the firstborn, one of the last children born to Jacob, the trickster who becomes Israel, this Joseph, who's a little punk kid who's telling his dreams and taking off his brothers, who becomes a slave in a pit, who becomes a slave in a foreign country, who becomes an imprisoned slave in a foreign country. God continues to be with him. It tells us over and over. And again, it's the all caps. It's Yahweh was with him. And what happens? In the end, because of the people giving him opportunity, be it Potiphar, be it the jailer, be it Pharaoh, Joseph ends up as the second most powerful person in the world of the Bible in this part of Genesis. They would say Egypt is the greatest power in the world, and Joseph is number 2. Why? Because God says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. In Egypt, a foreign country, in the midst of a worldwide calamity, has all the food, all the power. And why? Because they blessed someone in the line of Abraham. It is like the most extreme underdog story one could imagine. That the grandson of a nomad who's one of the last born of that family would be the second most powerful person in the world, saving nations. Not because he was so smart, not because he had so much power, but because I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those that curse you. And so as we come to this point in the Joseph story, it's like the fulfillment to the extreme of that promise to a wandering nomad who comes into a land with nothing. We watch them get richer. We watch them in situations seem to gain power, but throughout we see them with the favor of God upon them, to the point that they are literally ruling and saving the world. Okay? So on one point, you'd say this would make a great conclusion to the book of Genesis, right? You can see a da-da, Genesis ended. I told you I would do this. Now you're the most powerful people in the world. But just as important of a theme in Genesis is the idea that in the end, God restores brothers and families. God is in the business of bringing families back together. And despite all these breaks that we see at the first time where a brother kills a brother, in this family, once God starts over with Abraham, it is trying to bring brothers and families together. Isaac, Ishmael, that one separates and doesn't come back together. And we find the Ishmaelites actually buying and selling children of the line of Isaac. But Jacob, Esau, that one you thought that could never come back together. But in the end, it does. God brings them together back into wholeness. But this story, we look at and you think, okay, but that's not possible because these guys were going to kill him and sold him into slavery. There's no way this can all come back together. And that will be what comes next. So our last chapters of this story goes beyond the blessing and cursing theme. This is about, but can this relationship be restored? And in his own Joseph-y kind of way, which is a bit conniving and bratty, this restoration will still happen. And we may read it through a lens a little differently because usually it's like, oh, poor sweet little Joseph. How can he, find a way to be back with his brothers? We're going to find out. I think he's a bit of a piece of work. And you could say, well, that's okay. He has the right to because, what his brothers did. But Joseph is not all, sweetness and sunshine. So for the next week or so, as we finish this up, that's what's left on the table. How does God bring a family together? Because ultimately, that is an extremely important story, part of the story, not just of Genesis, but the entire story of scriptures. How does God bring back to shalom, back to this wholeness and completeness, all peoples? Let's start with the family of Abraham. Right.
Well, that's certainly timely.
Questions? Say that again.
I said that theme is timely.
Exactly right. No, exactly right. I had the opportunity to do a devotion with our executive team, and it was on last Thursday. And usually, you're supposed to do devotions on, slight, small little passages and pluck something out of one verse. And I did my super speed run through the book of Genesis as best I could in a short time frame. But to point out this theme that in a story of broken families and broken relationships, God's in the business of making whole. So as we sit on a Sunday with a Wednesday inauguration coming, with threats about all kinds of things happening all throughout the land and worry about state capitals and worries about all kinds of things, we look at our world and we see it as as a nation that's split in ways that I hear the commentator saying it, right? Like, this can't be put back together
Mm.
People are saying, oh, this is like the next civil war. This is like, we can't come back together. And I read Genesis and I think, yeah, that's what I would have said about Joseph and his brothers too. All right. So we are going to read, I don't know if we can get to it next week. Maybe it'll be 2 weeks as we finish out. But we will read about how in all these things, what even the brothers meant for evil, God used for good. And in the restoring and saving of many lives. So here's what I want to leave you with this day as we go into this week. I've been struggling with this as I think this through in all my communities and school communities and friends and neighbors. We live in a world where we are continually signaling to people through our words, our actions, our language, our posts, our likes, right? Am I with these guys or those guys? Am I part of the us or are you part of the them, right? Like this is the world we live in. And figuring out what it means to be the church that says we're not picking sides of those.
Mm-hmm.
We are finding ways to represent something that is greater than all those, that is more powerful than all those, and that our allegiance is not to those, it's to a different kingdom and a different order. We, like Abraham, are sojourners in a foreign land. And as the New Testament reminds us, right, this is not our home. Let me do one thing. I'm worried I'm going to lose power. I got to just make sure I'm plugged in. All right, there we go. I want us to remember as we figure out how to navigate this time with friends, neighbors, coworkers, church friends, that Jesus lived through a period of Roman occupation and persecution, and he didn't spend much time talking about Romans, other than saying, fine, pay your taxes, right? He lived in a very tumultuous time where things were falling apart in his land. What is it? Paul spent his entire ministry in a Roman Empire that was persecuting the church and trying to kill him. He doesn't talk about him much, except in Romans 13, where he says basically the state has the power God gave to it. So hear me in this. I'm not being political at all. I'm being apolitical. We need to be Christ-centered, body-centered, and be the church.
Mm-hmm.
Have a simple answer to go, so here's what that means. But if we think in an us-them mentality, let's think of the us as the body and the them as everyone else that we want not to fight with, but that we figure out how to help the them become part of the us. And how that looks in the midst of this next week and what follows, I have no idea. So that's what we need to be thoughtful, prayerful, and in conversation about. So maybe we're reading Genesis at just the right time.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have thought Genesis would play into like national insurrections and divides, but maybe it does. Thoughts, comments, feelings?
I have one question. When they talk about Pharaoh collecting all of the grain, did Pharaoh own all of the fields, or did Pharaoh take from the farmers to store it up for the country and then sell it back to the farmers once the famine came? Or was all of the land at that point in time Pharaoh's to start with?
Yeah, everything would be considered Pharaoh's.
Okay, they were just
Everything would be considered Pharaoh's. And in the ancient world, for the most part, it was usually seen as the king owns everything.
okay.
It's like you're leasing from them, and they're so nice to you, they let you keep some of your grain for yourself, but the rest goes to, even in ancient Israel, right? Like some goes to the temple. It's the idea of like it's the king's land because the king is God's son, right? So it's all God's and the king represents it so they can do what they want.
Okay.
Yeah, good point.
So to your point about relationships, that even the relationship between Pharaoh and Joseph was obviously healed, or maybe Pharaoh didn't recognize him, but surely he did.
Well, remember, it's Pharaoh's servant Potiphar who throws him into prison. So it's not Pharaoh himself, it's Pharaoh's servant Potiphar, who's like his captain of the guard. So while he might have seen him around, yeah, he didn't work for him before. Yeah. Anything else?
The only question I had, you talked about how God bless the family as it goes down, but it kind of seems like he picks one. He doesn't
Yes.
necessarily bless everybody. It's just, okay, were you lucky enough to be the one of each generation he picks?
That's exactly right. So there is a line, right? There is a string that goes through the family, and the string is always the younger.
Right.
Never the culturally expected that it would be the oldest, which continues not just in Genesis, right? That's a scriptural motif. It's always the younger, which even think of the most famous one, David, right? The guy that they didn't even think to bring to be seen because he was so little and young. Like, well, of course, not him. Yeah. Anything else?
I was struck that when the dream that Joseph tells him is it's not a good dream. And I wonder if those magicians could only tell the Pharaoh the good dreams. If they had bad dreams, here's the baker over here.
Yeah.
And and Joseph is very somewhat good. When he says, it's not me. God will tell Pharaoh what to do.
Yeah.
And then Pharaoh kind of covers himself by never acknowledging God. He kind of puts it's all through Joseph.
Yeah.
So if things don't go well, I think Joseph's on the hook.
Well, you know what? And think about this, because here, you bring up something, a very important point that I failed to mention. Joseph keeps saying, God will tell you, God will tell you, God tells the dreams. Pharaoh would have been perceived as God himself, right? Pharaoh is divine in Egypt. And so there's a bit of boldness when Joseph keeps saying, God will show you. There is a theological statement being made in that moment, because the Pharaoh was seen as divine, which again, when we get to Exodus, is going to be a really important thing. When the final plague of the death of the firstborn, you kill the heir of the God. Yeah, good point. Anyone else? All right, let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this day that you give us. We thank you for your scripture, and we thank you for the fact that these words have been recorded for us thousands of years ago to tell us about a world, a family, and a relationship that has just as much power and meaning to touch and shape us today. So help us, God, hear your word through these words. Make us be better in reflecting you and being your people. God, be with us in this time and in this world to be your people in the midst of conflict, divisiveness, and divide. Let people see us, hear us, and say, that is the body of Christ. Be with us as we protect our land. God, protect and heal our people. Be with those among us who are struggling with COVID and all manner of sickness. God, may your hand be upon us, and may all we do shine your light and give you glory. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Have a great week, everybody. And we probably, I would think, at our pace, have maybe 2 more weeks to finish Genesis. So begin. Sean already started prompting me with an email. Start thinking about what comes next. What are people interested in studying, learning, and hearing about? Well, I'll throw out some suggestions, but be thinking if there's something like, hey, we've never talked about this or read this book or dealt with this topic that you might have interest in. So we'll spend a little time next week starting to think about that. All right. All right. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next Sunday, if not before.
Thank you.
See ya.